Well, I think an analysis of sort of Jungian archetypes in the shadow within the context of Bram Stoker's Dracula would actually be pretty interesting, and I'm certain someone's done that and has written a whole dissertation on that. But that's not actually why we're here right now. We're here to study Revelation chapter 8, verse 7. So that's what we're going to do. So yes, we are in fact back from the break, and as is our sort of way of doing this, we're going to be going through each judgment, taking a week per judgment. Sometimes they're bigger than others. In this case, it's just a single verse, but we're still going to study it with the same sort of level of depth that we have been. There are going to be a couple exceptions to this. So, for example, when we get to chapter 9, some of those are long, and we're going to have to break this up into 2 sessions, just as an example. But in general, we're going to stick to the one judgment per week. So, with that said, let's pray in. Heavenly Father, I thank you for our time here. I thank you for your word. I pray that you will open these scriptures to us and tell us what you have for us to learn, not only in an intellectual sense, but what we're supposed to personally do with this and what we're supposed to take away from this, Lord. I pray that these won't simply be my words and thoughts and ideas, but that they will be something that come from your heart that speak to us, Lord. Amen. All right, so let's do what we always do. Let's read the passage. Verse 7. The first angel sounded, and hail and fire followed, mingled with blood, and they were thrown to the earth. And 1/3 of the trees were burned up, and all the grass was burned up. So, as always, I'm going to hit the main point, vision. In this case, it's fairly self-explanatory, but there are some parts that I want to dive into a little bit. We're talking about the hail, fire, and blood. For those of you that are familiar with Exodus, that should sound familiar, and there's a reason for that. Then we have judgments. Now we're going to start seeing this in thirds. That'll be sort of a theme going forward. We're going to have 1/3 of the earth burnt up. That is specifically referring to arable land. So don't just think of this as like desert or just rocks or something getting burned up. It's specifically talking about arable land that is burnt up. And then 1/3 of the trees are burnt up. And all the green grass is eventually burned up as well. There's a nuance to that that causes some problems when you read forward to Revelation 9 verse 4 that we're going to discuss. It's not a huge deal one way or the other, but it does trip some people up. Then I want to discuss kind of 2 questions in closing. Why attack the earth specifically? You can understand God, judging man. Man has sinned. He has consciously made some choice to sin, but why go after the earth? What's going on there? Why is he doing that? And then I want to sort of address the question, because now we're really starting to get into some of the heavy judgments. Isn't God going overboard here? The answer is no, he's not. But I do want to address that, and I also want to address some... As I was going over the break, I had a chance to actually sit back and think about things a little bit, and I came to sort of an interesting realization with the way that we perceive ethics within our various ethical systems, and I want to kind of throw that in there. So, for nothing else, you'll hear me ramble for 5 minutes about stuff that only I care about. All right, so the main point, God is judging the earth, and by extension, man. God goes, he wipes out 1/3 of the crops and all the arable land. That's going to cause a lot of problems for man. We've got fire and blood raining down. We're seeing a sort of broad-based destruction of the fauna and a lot of the agriculture on the earth at a global scale. These judgments that we're seeing are cumulative. We're not just getting different perspectives on the same thing. They're sort of increasing in intensity. So everything that we've already seen is going to get, consequently multiplied as well. So we've already seen famine, desolation, we've seen pestilence. That is all going to be naturally increased by what we are seeing here. Now, as I said, this is a fairly straightforward passage from an exegetical perspective. Exegesis being, pulling out what the text says and just sort of treating it as that. At this point, we are clearly dealing with something supernatural. Whatever mechanism God may have chosen to use to bring this about, it's very clear that he is actively involved in this. because of that, I don't want to sit here and try to figure out exactly how he's going to make this or that kind of thing happen. I'm just going to take the text as it is, and instead what we're going to do is sort of look through what this is actually going to mean on the earth, what it's going to do, and sort of start to brainstorm some of the second and third order effects of this. We do have examples in history of some events like this happening that we can pull from, and we have, in some cases, actually counter examples to sort of show what it looks like when phenomena like this happen on the earth. And then finally, I kind of want us to think through the question, what is the point of all this? Why is God going so far in judging? Whenever we think that God is going too far in his judgments, we need to understand that that's fundamentally a failure of us to understand the holiness of God and how repulsive our sin is to him. When you really get down to it, whenever you read through the Old Testament and God is talking about all the judgments that he's going to bring on Israel or whatever, and you think that he's maybe taking it too far, realize that in all reality, he would be totally justified in wiping everyone out and starting again if he felt like it. And the fact that he is not, in fact, wiping everybody out, but that there's always some sort of a remnant that's saved shows, if nothing else, his mercy and his grace through all of that. Furthermore, it is tempting to look at these judgments that God is giving as him just blindly lashing out in rage at the earth, like he's some raging drunkard or something like that. But that's not the case. Someone who is in a fit of rage will not be able to tell you ahead of time what they're going to do. They're just going to act out purely on thymotic instinct or whatever. Here he's telling us ahead of time exactly what he's going to do. He's told us specifically what he is going to do, how he's going to do it, where he's going to do it, how far he's going to go. He's going to say, I'm going to go this far and no further. He says, I'm going to destroy a third of this and a third of this. He didn't say, I'm going to destroy a third to a half of it. He said, no, it's exactly this amount. So he's not blindly acting out in rage. This is just. This is a just judgment that he is giving to the earth and the inhabitants of the earth. As always, we're going to start off with the vision. Candidly, I couldn't find any pictures that I really liked that depicted this. We've got the angel here with the trumpet. That's sort of fine if you really want to abstract this out. I don't like that the angel's sort of flying up here in the sky. That's not what the text says. The text shows them up in heaven, if you recall back from verse 6. So the seven angels who had the seven trumpets prepared themselves to sound. The implication in the text is that they're sitting there, they're all getting online, they're standing up there in heaven, getting ready to blow sequentially. We don't have sort of one angel going and flying around. We're going to see that later, but this is not really what the text says. Now, we do have a bunch of the trees being burnt up, and I can't show a third of the earth happening to that, so we're going to have to use some artistic license here. But that's fairly accurate. These are grasslands. If you want to picture those as actual arable lands, that's fine. Again, I wasn't a huge fan of the picture, but we will go with it. One other thing to note, because I came across this a lot, specifically with this as well as a lot of the other trumpet judgments when I was trying to find sort of good media for this. About half of them depict the angels as feminine, and about half depict the angels as masculine. I think that's an artifact of the Renaissance again. Every time you see an angel spoken of in the Bible, it's always in the masculine sense. Angels are male, they are masculine, they are not feminine. So again, guys, this is another reason why you should never compare your wife or whoever to an angel. That's a problem. Don't do that. All right. But yes, so I tried to pick one that had the angel relatively masculine, and this was kind of the best that I could come up with there. So with all of my little nitpickings out of the way, this is as close as I could get. All right, sounding the first trumpet. The first angel sounded. Cool. So, if you recall, last time we spoke, trumpets were used for many things in the scripture. It could be used to sound an alarm for the camp of Israel. You could use it to celebrate a victory. In fact, chapter 7, in part, was all about celebrating a victory that God was going to give them. It could be a call to battle. Or it could be used to ring in the new year, and that was one of the points that we mentioned as a possible eschatological connection here, is ringing in the new year, or more precisely starting to ring in the kingdom, basically preparing everyone for the fact that, hey, this is going to be showing up very soon. We are going to start seeing a very similar pattern and structure that we saw with the seals. So we had the seals, you got 6 of them that open, then you have the 7th one that opens up the next thing. So 6 seals, 7th, some sort of interlude, and then that 7th opens up into the next series of 7, wash, rinse, repeat. That's kind of the way it's used here. We're going to see it the same way with the bowl judgments of Revelation. It is at this point that we need to sort of understand that we're going to start seeing a parallelism between the judgments that we saw in Egypt and the judgments that are going to be here in the book of Revelation. In Egypt, you've got hail that comes down. That was one of the judgments. You've got blood in the water. That was the very famous one where the Nile turned to blood. You've got fire raining down, etc., etc. There is a structure to those judgments, and there's a parallel structure to the judgments here in Revelation. I've decided not to dive into that because it's probably a little too tangential for us, but if you want to track it down, there is in fact a pattern. One of the things that we need to understand from the book of Exodus, because it has relevance here, is that in the book of Exodus, God was doing a lot more than simply, causing a lot of pain to the Egyptians before they finally decided to let them go. He was demonstrating his power and his ability. He was demonstrating himself over whatever their religious system was, and he was also, in a sense, also attacking the powers behind that religious system. When you look at what was judged in Exodus, it wasn't random. The things that were being judged were all of the things that Egypt worshipped. They worshipped the sun. They worshipped the sun god Ra. What did God do? God took away their sun. He gave them darkness so terrible it could be felt. They worshipped the Nile. Very famously, they worshipped the Nile. What did God do? God took away the Nile from them. Interestingly enough, Egypt also worshipped frogs. So in a very twisted sense of humor, I have to imagine God said, fine, you want to worship frogs? I will give you all the frogs you could ever want to worship. It turns out they didn't want to worship them after that. The priests that were sort of going up against God and Moses, they were able to replicate these to a certain extent. Now, there's some debate as to whether or not, they were, faking it or not. If you read forward to Paul's letters to Timothy, he makes it clear that they were actually able to do this. They were not pretending or faking there. Regardless of how you look at it, they were able to keep up with the judgments until something interesting happens. Until lice was the judgment. Why would that be important? Within the magical system of Egypt, the priests were required to be clean. They had very elaborate rituals for their cleanliness. An attack of lice meant that they were ceremonially unclean and they could not be clean. In a sense, God is saying, fine, you want to see if you can go up against me? What happens when I take away your ability to do that, even within your own little system? So I think that's interesting that they were able to keep up until God did that. My point is, God wasn't just trying to get the attention of Egypt by giving them, for lack of a better term, a lot of pain. He was attacking the very things that they worship. He was attacking their system of worship, and he was attacking the demonic powers behind that system that were being worshipped. He was very specifically attacking those things, I believe. I think that we can see a similar pattern start to emerge here. You can imagine these people on Earth. They're going to start having to put their trust in something, whatever that is. Yes, there's going to be, the coming world leader on the scene at this time, but people are going to want to hang on to and cling to anything, regardless of what that is, and he's taking away everything. Furthermore, we're going to start seeing pretty active demonic forces as we continue on in the book of Revelation, and I almost have to wonder if God isn't making a point to them as well, saying, guys, I am attacking you. You know what's coming. I have to imagine he's doing that as well. So I wanted to bring that up here first because this is where we're going to start really seeing a lot of that parallelism. You can kind of just file that mentally away in the back of your mind. Next, And hail and fire followed, mingled with blood, and they were thrown down to the earth. So there's a couple things we need to understand here. There's an interpretation of this that notes that this sort of description of hail and fire and stuff coming down is similar to volcanic eruptions that would happen in the region of Asia Minor. That may have some relevance within the mind of John, so when he sees whatever is going on in the vision, he may be like, oh yeah, I remember that one time I saw a volcano explode. That being said, I don't think that that's really what's going on here. First of all, it's very clear that what we're dealing with here is not a minor local event. We're not just talking about a single eruption of a volcano or many eruptions of volcanoes, although if God chose to use that as a mechanism, I'm certain he could. But I don't really think that's what's going on here. That being said, it also doesn't explain why it would be raining blood from a lacerated sky, if anyone gets that reference. It doesn't explain why there would be blood coming down. I've seen a lot of volcano explosions. I haven't really seen that one happen. So it's clear that there's something else going on here. Again, I think this is a callback to Exodus chapter 9, if we want to go there. Exodus chapter 9, starting verse 23. And Moses stretched out his rod toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and fire darted to the ground, and the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. So there was hail and fire mingled with the hail, so very heavy that there was none like it in the land of Egypt since it became a nation. And the hail struck through the whole land of Egypt, all that was in the field, both man and beast, and the hail struck every herb of the field and broke every tree of the field. Only in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel were, was there no hail. That's interesting. I've seen a lot of hail in my time, but I haven't seen it be that specific that it will sort of ethnically determine who it wants to attack and who it doesn't want to attack. I haven't seen that one yet, so clearly there was something supernatural going on there. And I'd argue, again, there's something equally supernatural going on here in Revelation chapter 8. Much of what we see in the book of Exodus, we're going to see in the book of Revelation, just sort of with the decimal point moved over. God is sort of adding a few exclamation points to what he's doing. There, he was judging, a single nation to deal with a single people. Here, he's going to be judging the entire earth to deal ultimately with the establishment of the kingdom. We also see this called out in Joel. Joel is an interesting book because it's very small. It's only a few chapters. But it has a lot to do with eschatology. And unfortunately, it's one of those books that because we've called it the minor prophets, we tend to skip over. But if we want to go to Joel chapter 2, starting in verse 28, he calls out this event. He says, "And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and young men shall see visions. Also my men servants and my maid servants, I will pour out my spirit in those days." So again, whenever you see that day or those days or whatever, this has an eschatological connotation. "And I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon into blood before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. And it shall come to pass that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. For Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there shall be deliverance. And the Lord has said, among the remnant whom the Lord calls." So again, we see fire called out, pillars of smoke, all those kind of things. We're seeing a very similar concept here. One of the interesting things about Joel is that he was one of the earliest writing prophets. There's another way to distinguish the prophets between the ones that did writing and those that didn't. You'll see in the book of Kings many prophets that are mentioned, but they never left any writings for us. Joel is one of the earliest writing prophets, which is interesting because much of what he talks about is dealing with eschatology. You would imagine that he would be dealing, exclusively with local events for Judah or what have you, but he's not. And I think that's interesting because it shows just how important God treats this period of time that's eventually going to come to pass. That from the earliest point, he was talking about it. from the earliest prophets, he was speaking of what eventually would come to pass to bring in the kingdom period. At this point, we need to figure out, is what's being spoken of here literal, or is it symbolic in some sense? Are we literally seeing hail and fire and brimstone and blood, etc., rain down from heaven on the earth and start burning everything up? Or is God talking about something different? The symbolic way of looking at this is to say that this is very similar to other apocalyptic literature of the time, and that it was sort of just following those trends. The problem is that when you do that, you're essentially comparing the inspired text to other non-inspired things, and you're trying to equate the two, which causes problems in its own right. Second of all, if you do a careful inspection of this versus the other sources it looks at, it's very clear that this isn't simply, apocalyptic. It is prophetic. It is very specifically saying that it is prophetic. So we have to put it within that context and treat it as prophecy, as opposed to general people talking about the end of the world in whatever poetic way they might want to. The literal interpretation is to look at this and say that basically everything up until this point has in fact been literal. God is trying to communicate himself in a way that's going to be understood. The best way to do that is in plain, normal, average, everyday Greek, and to communicate it to people in the way that they're actually going to be able to understand it. Furthermore, a literal interpretation best aligns with the broader sense within which this specific event is spoken of in the prophets. I've got a couple examples up there from Isaiah 10, 11, 30, Jeremiah 16, 23, Ezekiel 28, and Micah 7. I'm going to choose a single one of those. If you want, we can go to Isaiah 10, starting in verse 20. There is more going on in the context of what Isaiah is talking about here, but for our purposes, we're only going to look at the eschatological portion. I specifically chose this passage to read through because there's a very interesting phrase that pops up that is missed by most sort of students of prophecy, and I wanted to make you aware of it. So, Isaiah 10, starting in verse 20. And it shall come to pass in that day, again, the day of the Lord, that the remnant of Israel, and such as have escaped of the house of Jacob, will never again depend on him who defeated them, but will depend on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. This hasn't happened yet. You could say that, Isaiah was speaking about, a return of the remnant from Babylon or what have you. Okay, fine. But that hasn't happened yet. Israel, even today, isn't really relying on the Lord, so this hasn't happened yet. The remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. For through your people, O Israel, be as the sand of the sea, a remnant of them will return. The destruction decreed shall overflow with righteousness, for the Lord God of hosts will make a determined end in the midst of the land. Therefore, says the Lord God of hosts, O my people who dwell in Zion, do not be afraid of the Assyrian. He shall strike you with a rod and lift up his staff against you in the manner of Egypt. For yet a very little while, and the indignation will cease, as will my anger at their destruction. And the Lord of hosts will stir up a scourge for him, like the slaughter of Midian at the rock of Oreb. And his rod shall be on the sea, and he will lift it up in the manner of Egypt. So he was talking about a lot of things there. Partly this in the end times. But I wanted to point out, in an eschatological sense, speaking specifically to the nation of Israel, he refers to someone that they are not to be afraid of, and he calls him the Assyrian. That's interesting. Assyria was not the people that was eventually going to destroy Judah. That was Babylon. Assyria was eventually going to destroy the northern kingdom, but that's not who he's talking about. Furthermore, he's talking about here the day of the Lord. You can track this down if you want. There's a couple other references to it. I believe the Assyrian as a title, is a title for the person most people commonly ascribe to, the Antichrist. That is another one of his titles. He has 33 titles in the Old Testament and 13 in the New. I think that's another one of those titles. No. Okay. So for those of you listening online, is Assyrian where we get the word assassin? No, it's not. Assyrian was a people group broadly from the area of what you and I would sort of call northern Iraq into Syria. Syria, totally different things. It gets confusing. Assassin it's basically comes into the English from the Arabic. They were a group of people that worked, I believe, originally for the Abbasid Caliphate, that were sort of an extension of their power that would basically go in and assassinate you or threaten to assassinate you if you didn't do what the Caliph wanted. No, I realize why you might think that, but then two totally different words there. Anyway, my personal view on the matter is that we are dealing here with literal judgments. God is calling out something very literal that is happening and is going to happen. The problem is whenever you try to look at these in a symbolic way, you have to start coming up with increasingly intricate reasons why something represents one thing in one place and it doesn't represent the same thing in another place, and it starts getting very, very convoluted, and you have entire tomes written on how you're supposed to interpret it. And if you're just an average farmer in Asia Minor and you're trying to figure out what God is saying, I don't really think that's how God is going to choose to communicate. I think he's just going to tell you what he's going to do. So I'm going to take this as literal until someone can very convincingly prove me otherwise. And a third of the trees were burned up. And the green grass was burned up. Less clear in the English, but very clear in the Greek. When he talks about a third of the trees were burned up and they were thrown up in all the earth, he's specifically talking about the arable land. So it's not talking about desert somewhere. It's not talking about attacking the Sahara or the Gobi or the Antarctic regions or something like that. This is specifically the land that is capable of producing food, of being useful for agriculture that people would actually want to have. So it is that land specifically that is targeted. You can imagine that if this was some bizarre random phenomenon, it would sort of attack things in a more distributed way. But again, we're dealing with something supernatural here, so God is specifically targeting those aspects that man needs for life, quite frankly. This is going to make it harder to grow food. It's going to increase existing food shortages, and it's going to make the already existing hunger and starvation worse. Now, it's clear that this is this is not a random event. I would imagine even if under sort of whatever lies and delusions people have at this moment, they would have to realize that something is in fact going on here. I'm reminded of the precision God uses in Joshua chapter 10. If we cast our minds back to Joshua chapter 10, Joshua is leading, the armies of Israel against, the local inhabitants, and in so doing, he asks God for a miracle to help him win the battle, and God calls down essentially meteors on the enemies of Israel, and they, kill all of them. They get the victory in the battle. Well, that's interesting because it's really, really convenient that they only happened to hit the enemy and didn't happen to hit all the people of Israel, even though they're kind of like right next to each other. God was very precise in how he chose to do that, just like he's very precise here. Now, more broadly speaking, God does use natural disasters and judgments, etc., as his way of getting people's attention, as his way of judging people or trying to bring them back to him. As a few examples, he's used famine in the past in 2 Kings chapter 6. That was a very famous example where God sent a famine to the northern kingdom because, they were sinning. He's used sickness, and he specifically calls out sickness in Deuteronomy 28 as something that he will send specifically to Israel if they, turn against him. He uses war. Nahum speaks about this in relation to the destruction of Nineveh by Babylon, and with the prophet Habakkuk, specifically again of Babylon conquering Judah for their sin. One of the research projects you might want to take up at some point, this is kind of on my back burner right now with other research that I'm doing, but go through the Bible, find the list of all of the natural disasters that God has given, categorize those natural disasters, and then see why God brought them about. Here God says that he brought a flood because of this reason. Here God said he brought drought because they were worshiping idols. Here God says that he brought this because of that. Lay those out and see if there's a pattern to why God does that. Can you equate a specific judgment to a specific sin? Then once you have that list, take that and overlay it on history and see if the pattern still holds. That's a fun research project to do at some point. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to do it right now myself, but if you want to be my research assistant, I would very much appreciate it. Yes, my personal hypothesis is that God is consistent with the way he judges, and he's very specific and precise in the way that he judges things. I just need to see if that actually holds out here and if I can prove it that way. Now we're going to have a third of the trees that are burnt up. Again, this is specifically against the cultivatable land. It's interesting that the trees are burnt up because this is going to have a lot of far-reaching impacts. First of all, those trees are going to be destroyed. You need those trees for fruit. You need those trees for more than just that. Again, you need food to survive. But when you get rid of all the trees, you actually have a lot of other second, third order effects that happen. First of all, trees are really good at blocking wind. If you get rid of the things that are blocking wind, you have nothing to prevent things like the Dust Bowl. So now you're going to take all of that soil that's now loose, you're going to start kicking it up into the atmosphere, and now you're going to make things even worse because now you've got a lot of poor soil going and spreading itself over good soil, so it's going to make it harder to actually grow things. Who here has seen the movie Interstellar? Okay, yeah, it's kind of similar to that, where everything kind of just starts breaking down. I actually really like the movie Interstellar. Everything just kind of starts breaking down, and no one can actually do anything anymore. And even though you've got some sort of technology, eventually it starts falling apart, and the natural disasters just sort of continue to increase. This is a picture of sort of the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. I can imagine that on sort of a global scale because of what we have going on here. Interestingly, there's a counter to this. You've probably heard of the Great Wall of China. Well, China's done a similar thing. They call it the Great Green Wall, or the Green Wall of Beijing, where basically they're trying to prevent the desertification of northern China from the Gobi Desert. So they're just planting a whole bunch of trees to try and prevent that. They've noticed the link between those two things. Plant a whole bunch of trees, all of a sudden it stops. Well, now if a third of the trees are burnt up, that doesn't apply anymore. This became an especially large issue in 2008 with the Beijing Olympics, because Beijing is not exactly in the best position, so they went in and actually planted a huge number of trees to basically clean up a lot of the air and prevent it from getting inundated. Another thing that's not remarked on is you're going to have less oxygen creation because of that. Trees absorb carbon dioxide, they expel oxygen. Well, now if you have a third of the trees that just got burnt up, you're going to have more carbon dioxide in the air. You're going to have less of it being, less oxygen actually being expelled. People are going to literally start choking to death, which is kind of horrific. Now, yes, there's going to be fewer people there, but you've also got a third of the world literally burning. That's going to throw up a lot of carbon dioxide that you're going to need to get rid of in some way. And the very things that are burning are no longer going to be there to actually do that natural scrubbing process. You're also going to have a lot more erosion that's going to happen. Trees lay down a lot of roots. One of those things that those roots do is they keep the soil actually in place. If you remove all those trees, you take them out, you weaken them, whatever, all of a sudden there's nothing to prevent landslides. There's nothing to prevent all of that erosion. There's nothing to keep all that soil from actually moving around, which is going to increase death tolls through secondary and tertiary effects. It's going to make the soil less useful for cultivation. And again, it just sort of keeps knocking the effects on and on and on. All the green grass is burnt up. Now, we have a problem here. If we turn over to Revelation chapter 9, verse 4, this is speaking of the sort of locusts from the bottomless pit that are coming up. They were commanded not to harm the grass of the earth or any green thing or any tree, but only those men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. It says they are not to harm any of the green grass. Well, we've got a problem here, because here it says all the green grass was burnt up. So how is it that we can have all the green grass here burnt up, but yet we still have green grass there later with the fifth trumpet? As I've stated before, I don't think that these are sort of given out of order. I do think, by and large, we're seeing the judgments take place in order. So how do we account for this? The first is that there could be some time lapse between the two judgments. A couple months, maybe a year, who knows what that time lapse actually is. And in that time, you could have that grass regrow. That's a possibility. Another possibility, it specifically says all the green grass was burnt up. It's possible there is grass that still exists, but it's not green yet. It either hasn't matured or it's sort of in a dead state. You could take that as an example. There could also be some third phenomenon that we don't know about yet. I will not completely discount that at this point. I'm more than welcome to say that I don't know what I don't know, because we're starting to see things that have candidly never happened before. There could be rules of nature that we haven't discovered yet that will allow this to come back. It could be that, there is sufficient time for it to happen. It could be something else that I just candidly can't think of right now. So I'm not going to throw that out. I mostly bring that point up because it's something that a lot of people like to point to and say that, there's a contradiction in the Bible. No, not really. I don't really have a hard time swallowing that one. Now, what does this actually do? Well, first of all, livestock need grass. Aside from all the other things that we talked about with erosion and, wind and things like that, cattle need grass. Sheep need grass. Goats need grass, etc., etc. If you take that away, they're not really able to graze anymore, or whatever grazing they do have is very limited and will be under famine conditions. That's also going to lead to increases in price for things like meat or milk or what have you. Per our conversations on, I believe it's the third seal in chapter 6, we noted that there's hyperinflation that's already going on, and this is going to add to that. During periods of hyperinflation, it's generally the poor that get impacted the most, whereas the rich are still able to actually acquire some goods through other means. So this is going to be hurting the food supply of the people that are going to be sort of the most vulnerable to disruptions in prices or food. If you've been following the news recently, that's one of the reasons Iran is so up in arms right now, is because they've had inflation to the point that even the bazaar merchants are saying they don't really want the government around anymore. So yes, these things do happen, and actually I believe technically the meat price in Iran has gone up, I think 15% from last. Yeah, it's not quite Weimar levels, but I can't remember what their currency is. It's not the real, but it's something like that. It's at like 1.4 million to the dollar right now. So whenever you're measuring your currency against the dollar in millions, there's a fundamental problem. Yes.
This idea about the time. You're sitting there and you're fighting somebody, bam, 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 really fast. You hit them so many times really fast, it's gonna all blend together. But wham, you give him some time to recover a little bit, wham again. So it could be that they're giving them the time.
That's an interesting perspective. So for everyone listening online, the hypothesis was put forward that God basically gives them time to recover with the green grass, so that the impact of what happens next is even more pronounced and felt, as opposed to if you just destroy everything all at once, people don't really have the ability to process that. I think that's a valid way of looking at this. Again, God's not really trying to be nice here. He's candidly going out of his way to destroy and get people's attention. So I could see that. Next, aside from simply consumers that are going to need these agricultural products, it's going to actually hurt the people that are farming these products. They tend to operate on very tight margins throughout all of history, and I don't think that's really going to change in either the near or far future unless some really weird things start happening. So yeah, they're not really going to be able to grow anything, so they're not really going to be able to sell anything, and they're going to become even more desperate. All it means is it's just going to increase the famine. So here's the question we have to come up with. Why attack the earth? Again, you can understand God attacking man specifically. We can understand God attacking, human beings, sinful people that we saw in chapter 6. But in chapter 8 and kind of going forward, we're going to see not just that, we're also going to see attacks physically against the earth. What did the earth ever do to God? Remember, these are in fact judgments, and God is still judging man. And if he chooses to judge man directly or through, other mechanisms, God is perfectly allowed to do that. One of the points that we saw is only God is worthy to do this. Remember, we discussed that in chapters 4 and 5, that word worthy, it means not just that he has the moral, capability and character to do this, but he also has the power to do this. He also has the wisdom and the insight that only he has. Remember, only he is worthy, so only he has the wisdom and the insight to know how that judgment should be carried out. I may sit back here and say, no, you shouldn't actually touch the earth. That doesn't make any sense. But he's like, Paul, you don't actually know what you're talking about. I do, in fact, know what I'm doing here. This kind of leads to one of the problems that I was discussing and actually thinking about over the break, and it's the issue of ethics and our perspective on things. There's sort of three schools of ethics that I'm going to get into here. For our purposes, I'll talk about ethics as sort of doing the right thing. That's a very watered down version, but for our purposes, doing the right thing. There's virtue ethics, there's deontological ethics, and then there's consequentialism. So virtue ethics, this is what you classically think of when you think of Greece. It's a bunch of people sitting around trying to figure out how they're going to cultivate themselves to be better. The idea is, ethics or doing the right thing is just like any other habit that you develop. You just practice it over and over. You do it, you sort of build yourself up over time. And if every single day I decide that I'm going to give to charity, eventually I will always do that and I'll be a really good person. That's virtue ethics in a nutshell. Deontological ethics says there's right, there's wrong. I've decided that I'm going to do right. I've arbitrarily decided that at no point in my life will I ever kill anyone because I've decided that killing anyone under any circumstances is wrong, and no one's ever going to move me from that, and I'm just going to do that. Consequentialism is, hey, ends justify the means kind of idea, and it doesn't really matter how I get to where I want to go. If the end result is better in some broadly defined way, then it's good to get there, even if I have to, do a lot of bad things along the way. So virtue ethics are fine, but it gets a little works trippy, and there's nothing really outside of the individual or some limited school or limited scope that determines what is or is not right. You have nothing outside the system that tells you this is right or this is wrong. It's a useful tool, but it doesn't actually tell you what's right or wrong. Deontological ethics, it is a solution, but you can actually get to a lot of unintended consequences because of that. If anyone's ever watched the Batman movies, that's one of the things that they constantly stress. Batman has decided that he's never going to kill anyone, but because he's decided he never kills anyone, a lot of people end up dying because he's decided he's never going to do that. Again, it's a fictional example, but you get my point. And then consequentialism, that sort of makes the assumption that we, as limited, finite people, will understand what the consequences of our actions are going to be at any given time, and that we are capable of controlling things enough to say that, yes, this thing that I'm doing right now is terrible, but it's going to lead to a whole bunch of better things, down the road. The issue with all of those is it comes down to a lack of information on our part, and a fundamental inability for us to actually carry out our vision, even if we wanted to, have full insight into the matter. The only way out of the problem is to have an ethical or moral system delivered to you from outside of yourself, i.e. from God, and then you trust in Him to actually worry about the consequences. In other words, He goes and tells me, hey, this is right, this is wrong, do this, and yes, you may not understand the consequence, you may not understand why I'm telling you to do that, but just trust that I'm going to actually take care of that problem. That was one of the things that I was thinking of, and that's kind of one of the points that I wanted to bring up here. We may not understand why he's choosing to do all of that, but he is. That being said, I didn't want to leave you simply with that answer. One of the things that I came across, there's a decent amount of people who point out that the conditions that are going to exist after God is done with the judgments are essentially going to render the earth in an antediluvian state, in a state where the environment is similar in many respects to what you could have seen in the pre-flood era. And in so doing, they suspect that these judgments aren't simply about judging man, but they're also literally preparing the earth to be in ultimately a better state during the millennial kingdom period. As a single example of this, is anyone familiar with slash and burn techniques for agriculture? God just did a gigantic slash and burn technique for the entire world. That soil is going to be extremely fertile in a few years. I'm not saying that that's necessarily the correct way of looking at it, but I do think, at least to some extent, God is preparing the earth for what will eventually come when he is reigning. So, isn't God going overboard here? No. God has established his rules. We have broken those rules. He can choose to judge us however he wants. He's not arbitrary in this. He's already told us what he's going to do. There's a line that I'm really sick of seeing on people's bumper stickers or shirts in the mall that says, "Only God can judge me." You're right, that is true. Only God can judge you. I don't think you would be bragging about that if you understood what that actually meant. As we're told in Hebrews 10:31, it is a terrible thing to fall into the hands of the living God. That is a terrifying thing to think about. Because I am imperfect and am not capable of actually judging you the way God is, I can only give you a limited amount of judgment, but God can do it in an eternal sense. We like to think of Jesus as, the nice little carpenter that walks along the Sea of Galilee and pats children on the head. But after he did that, he said it would be better for you to have a millstone tied around your neck and thrown into the ocean than to harm one of these little children. And you shouldn't fear the one that can kill your body. You should fear the one, i.e. God, who can, take your soul and send it to Gehenna. That's what he can do. I don't think people would brag about God being able to judge them if they understood that. The next thing we need to understand is God is not arbitrary. God has very specifically laid out his judgments and his punishments. In fact, it's interesting. What is kind of the penultimate judgment that we see in the book of Revelation? It's basically hailstones on the entire earth, which is interesting. What was God's punishment for idolatry? It was being stoned. I think it's, in a weird way, God is stoning the entire earth for idolatry, for worshiping things other than him. I think God is very precise in his judgments. God makes and keeps his promises. This is one of the distinctions between the God of the Bible and Allah, the God of the Quran. Allah is untrustworthy. You cannot trust him. He does not make promises and keep them. That is always a problem within Islam. You can never actually be sure with Allah. In fact, if you've ever gone through the Arabian Nights, that concept features very prominently in a lot of those tales. I realize it's just secular stories, but it shows that at least within their own understanding, they understand that Allah cannot be trusted. He also tells us ahead of time what he's going to do. Again, you can't do that if you're arbitrary and just randomly acting out on a whim. I wanted to end by talking about the potter and the clay. This is a very famous story, or part of the book of Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 18. We're not going to read the whole thing just for time's sake. But in it, God says to Jeremiah, "Hey, I want you to go down, take a look at this potter." And so he goes down and looks at the potter, and he says, "You see that potter? He's shaping that piece of clay. He's moving it around. He's got it on his wheel. And then, oops, the thing that he's forming isn't right. It isn't good. So what does the potter do? Takes it, molds it back up, throws it away, and comes back to it and starts making it again." The point that God was making is, hey, Judah, I am the potter, you are the clay. I am trying to make you into the thing that I want you to be, but you're being resistant. Therefore, I'm going to, just like that potter, I'm going to take you, crumple you up, throw you away, put you in exile into Babylon for a bit, and then I'm going to make you into what you're supposed to be. If God makes something and doesn't fulfill his actions, he can, if he so chooses, push it aside and start again. That's, at least in some sense, what God is doing here. The earth and humanity has not done what God wanted it to be. So he's crumbling it up like the potter and the clay, and he's starting again. God has called each and every one of us to be that clay in some capacity, in some sense. We're not all called to do the exact same thing. If God is not getting us to be exactly where we want to be, can he throw us as believers aside? Not in terms of salvation. I'm not talking about that. That's not the issue I'm discussing here, but simply in terms of him using us and what he wants to do with us. I'd argue, in some cases, yes. We're told in 1 John chapter 5, I believe, that there is a sin that leads to death. There is a point at which he says, here and no further do you go. We saw that in Acts with Ananias and Sapphira. He said, nope, I'm not dealing with you anymore. I think we even saw that partly in the life of Moses. After Moses was disobedient, he said, no, I'm not going to, he still used him, but he kind of took away what might have been Moses's had it not been for that. I think we need to very carefully look at our lives and figure out, are we actually letting ourselves be molded by God, or is God at some point going to have to set us aside because we've refused to be molded by him? That's a very heavy thought, but I want to leave you with that. God will go to whatever lengths he deems necessary to get out of us what he actually needs from us. We can take the easy way and simply submit to him that way, or we can take the hard way where maybe he has to throw us aside 1 or 2 or 3 times before he finally gets us to where he wants us to be. I know it's a heavy thought to end on, but I think it's probably an appropriate one for us because, again, I don't expect us to be around for this passage in Revelation, but I do think that God expects us to be useful with the time that we're given. So let's pray out. Heavenly Father, thank you for our time here. I thank you for your word. I pray that we will be open and receptive to your working and shaping in our lives, Lord. I pray that we would not waste the time that we have, that we would not waste the times that you speak to us, Lord, that we would be open to you, to your guiding, to your leading, Lord. Thank you for these passages, Lord. I pray that we would not see you purely as a God of wrath, but as a God of love and of mercy, but also of justice, Lord, that we would understand what that truly means. I pray that we would not take these things for granted, Lord. I pray that we would look at you as a God that delights in keeping your promises, Lord, that delights in showing mercy, Lord. But that we would know that behind all of that, there is a judgment that is coming, Lord. I pray that you will prepare our hearts to go tell that to a lost and dying world, Lord. Amen. Next week, we're going to see a similar judgment, but in this case, it's not going to be sort of vegetation or earth that's struck. It's going to be sort of the sea and the things that are on it and in it that are struck. So that'll be next week. I'll see you.